Students, welcome back to American Government Today. We're going to be taking another look at our federal budget. And most specifically, we're going to look at the executive branch's role in the budget, what the president does with it, how that goes to Congress, and how these two branches really interact with one another. And just like this title implies, the president's responsibility or the executive branch's responsibility is to propose a budget. So what that means is that the president, thinking about his agenda, what he wants done, how he thinks money should be spent in government, he says, hey, this is my idea for how the money should be spent. And he really lobbies Congress, especially during the State of the Union speech that we saw each year, to really give them an idea of the programs that he wants to be put in place, how much money should be going toward them, what programs that he would like cut, and whether or not Congress agrees on it is subject to whatever Congress ultimately agrees on, what they ultimately appropriate, or the money that they ultimately give toward the federal budget that year. So the president's role, kind of think President PP proposing a budget. Really, that is his part in it. And we remember Congress, right? C is cash, or if you want to think of like the two S's as like dollar sign. Congress is the one who really appropriates these funds, but the president, for political purposes, he's able to put forth what he wants in hopes that it'll be reflected in that other branch, right? So I think part of it is really what the president wants. Part of it is political, what he wants to project to other people. So for step one, we're going to look at some images, and this is very difficult to parse. Whenever people talk about what is actually being spent on the budget, you really have to dig into the figures. It's not something that you can just say, all this money is going toward the military, right? What part of the military? Are we talking Department of Defense? Are we talking about some other type of foreign aid? Or are we talking about some relief programs in other countries? So be very careful how you lump these things together, if they should be split up, or if they should be lumped together. So for step one, we're going to look through these images together. And I want you to think about what the difference between discretionary and mandatory spending is. And you might be able to kind of figure out what mandatory means, right? If something is mandatory, it has to be spent, right? There are appropriations that are made over courses of several years. If we think of something like Social Security, there has to be money for that program that we spend regardless, because we have a population of people who are depending upon it, right? So it's not subject to the discretion of a year. On the other hand, discretionary spending is where Congress and the president, they're really able to go back and forth about what should be spent on what for that particular fiscal year. So they have discretion for that particular budget, right? So we're looking at the federal budget for 2019. And remember, this is the federal budget. So the federal government has different responsibilities than the state governments. The reason why you don't see much for things like education, for example, is because that is, generally speaking, more of a state-run institution. You will see the federal government give some money to education, but that's not their primary responsibility. Okay, so in 2019, the federal budget looks like this. And so the revenue is the money that you're bringing in. Here's where the money is actually coming from that is going to be spent. So a lot of where that comes from is from individual income taxes. If I work a job, a lot of that money or some of that money is going to go toward the federal government. Payroll taxes, they come from the employers themselves. They fund programs, specifically Social Security and Medicare. We have excise taxes, estate taxes, customs duties, and other miscellaneous things that are not part of the main source of revenue. And then corporate income taxes, if you think of businesses having money, and then some of that money that from products they sell, that going toward the budget. This is really where the money is coming from. So individuals, businesses, and then things like sales, part of the taxes on those. On the other hand, this is what the money is ultimately spent on. So we have mandatory spending, things like Social Security, money for older people so that they're able to subsist or have a living, retired people specifically. Medicare, which is a form of healthcare, right? Medicaid. And then we have discretionary spending. So this is, a lot of it goes towards defense or partially the military, and others go to, and they really break it up. They split it into two categories here, right? Defense and then non-defense. And we'll see kind of like how that comes to task down here. So to get a good example of like the discretionary part of it, so if we're looking on this side of the pie chart, usually we'll have about half that goes to defense. So whenever they put about half of the discretionary spending going towards defense, that's really accurate in terms of what's being asked for in the second one. And then we have a bunch of other programs that can be considered discretionary as well. So in the second one, this is the budget that Trump in the fiscal year 2020, this is what he requested. And it's a total of 1.3 trillion. Again, this is just discretionary. It doesn't have any of the mandatory Medicaid, Medicare, Social Security. Most of it, half of it, goes towards defense. We see other programs, and you can really see what presidents value by how they allocate their budgets. We have Veterans Affairs, Health and Human Services, some going towards education, Homeland Security, housing and urban development, justice, energy, transportation, agriculture. But these are just small parts of the pie, right? A lot of what makes up discretionary or the allocated money really does go towards defense, right? Or what we think of maybe as the military, Department of Defense, all of those things. They really take priority in a lot of ways. So for step 2, we're going to watch this video together, and I want you to identify 2 sources of revenue from for the federal government and 3 ways that money is spent. And this is a cool little video. It's called "What If the U.S. Budget Was Only $100?"
Have you ever wondered where all the money goes that your country spends? It's a fairly complicated matter, so today we hope to make it a little less complicated while focusing solely on the budget of the USA. The US government receives money each year, its revenue, while its outgoings are referred to as the national expenditure. How that money is spent, or how it's earned, is a matter of ongoing debate, and it should be, given that for all intents and purposes, it's your money being spent. To simplify how the budget is apportioned, today we'll imagine it's just a small household allowance. Follow us on the money trail. In this episode of the Infographic Show, if the United States budget was only $100, how would it be spending it? Don't forget to subscribe and click the bell button so that you can be part of our notification squad. First of all, let's take a look at where the money for the US budget comes from. The revenue comes mostly from you in the taxes you pay. In 2018, the US federal government will have a total revenue of $3.654 trillion. This sizable amount we are going to round down to $100. You can get an idea of how much the total budget is if we say that $1 of our 100 is equal to about $36 billion. Half of the U.S. federal revenue will come from income taxes and
So this all is reflected up here, right? Individual income taxes, payroll taxes.
Further 33% from payroll taxes. Payroll tax is the money the employer or employee pays for such things as Social Security, Medicare, health insurance, and unemployment insurance. 10% of the total
So that might be 2 sources of revenue you already have right there for the federal government.
revenue will come from corporate taxes and a further 4% from excise taxes and tariffs. This is a special hidden tax on certain items, sometimes referred to as a sin tax because it includes things we should probably consume less of, such as alcohol, cigarettes, and gasoline. The rest of the revenue will consist of money earned by the Federal Reserve and slightly less than that amount from estate taxes. An estate tax is money the government takes when a person dies and leaves cash, property, or stock to another person. This usually makes up 1% or less of the U.S. revenue. Now that we know where the money comes from, let's see if it's enough to provide for the very large household of the USA. The money the U.S. receives from taxes is the globe's largest revenue, but the U.S. is a big spender. The country will outlay more than it receives, making the USA one of many countries with a yearly deficit. Many other countries have a healthy-looking bank balance, such as oil.
So if we spend more money than we take in per year, that's called a deficit, right? And all that money combined over the years is called our national debt.
rich Qatar or the sensibly spending nation of Norway. As we will now see, the USA puts a lot of its cash into areas other countries seem to care much less about. One of those areas is the military, as you will know if you've watched our military-based episodes. And so, without further ado, we'll now take a look at some hard cash statistics. There are three types of government spending. Mandatory spending is the money that goes towards entitlements for the US people, safeguards such as Social Security, healthcare, and unemployment compensation. This amount makes the biggest dent in our
So that's reflected right here, the mandatory spending, the money that has to go towards these things.
$100 allowance. Mandatory spending is 62% of the entire budget, or $62 from our $100 budget. Social Security will cost about $27, Medicare about $15, and Medicaid about $11. Other mandatory programs, which could include things such as food stamps or many other welfare programs, will take up
the word entitlement is a weird word people use. Whenever you're entitled to something, it means you're owed something, right? So entitlement, kind of maybe rethink about what you think about that word if you've heard it in a more formal, informal context.
The rest of the mandatory budget. We should note here that there are fears that mandatory spending will outpace the money earned, as there will simply be too many people to take care of and not enough labor force. This is what happened in Japan, a country with a lot of old people and many young people choosing not to have children. Something else.
We're actually going through a similar demographic transition too in the United States, where we have a lot of old people, especially in just a few states, and not as many young people who want to have children.
To think about is the specter of massive job loss due to technological automation. As for the $38 we have left, most of that goes to what's called discretionary spending. This is part of the revenue that could change year by year depending on what Congress votes for. The third outlay is the money the US has to pay in interest for its national debt, which has almost reached $550 if we are still rounding down to our $100 budget. This interest keeps increasing, and in 2018 it will be about 9% of our $100 total revenue. This is another $9 from our budget that the US must keep paying lest it default on the debt. This national debt is by far the biggest in the world. After mandatory spending and interest, debt is paid.
So we keep accruing debt for our national government, and if we were to say, no, we're not going to pay back that debt, we would default it. But that really takes away what we consider to be the credit of the United States, and some people view that as a very bad thing.
Paid, we have about $29 left to keep the USA running smoothly. Where does the rest of the money go? According to the White House, in 2018, about $19 of our $100 will be spent on the American military. This is by far the biggest chunk of the total discretionary budget. It's more or less half of the $38 the government had left before it had to pay the interest on its debt. This means from our $29, we have just $10 left over for everything else, and there's a lot to pay for. The rest goes to other departments, of which there are many. About 50 cents goes to the Department of Agriculture, 44 cents goes to the Department of Transportation, $2 goes to the Department of Education, 26 cents goes to the Department of Labor, $1.20 goes to the Department of Homeland Security, 32 cents goes to the Department of the Interior, 77 cents goes to the Department of State and other international programs, $1.11 goes to the Department of Housing and Urban Development, 21 cents goes to the Department of Commerce, 76 cents goes to the Department of Justice, 32 cents goes to the Department of the Treasury, $2 goes to the Department of Veterans Affairs, and 81
So this is all reflected pretty nicely in this discretionary budget request.
cents goes to the Department of Energy. There will also be smaller amounts spent on multiple government agencies. And there's more still to pay. Quite a lot of the remaining money from the discretionary budget goes into the emergency fund in case of war or natural disaster, as well as current military overseas operations. This involves multiple agencies, departments, and organizations, and amounts to around $2.30. If you add up the entire budget, it is more than the entire revenue, which is just the way it works out each year in the USA. To save a few pennies,
so by this point, we regularly expect to have a deficit each year. We've always really had a debt or a deficit. Some years that we've actually had more revenue, there is sometimes whenever that bridge has narrowed. But for the most part, we expect to spend more than we bring in. And raising taxes is unpopular. It's really unpopular in the United States, which explains some of that.
The Trump administration has made a few minor changes, such as taking out about 3 cents of our $100 that was previously allocated to arts and cultural agencies. At the same time, Trump has also controversially decreased NASA's budget by about 1 cent. If you watched our episode NASA versus SpaceX, you'll know Trump aspires to send men back to the moon, or later even Mars. NASA was budgeted just over 50 cents for 2018. The budget deficit for 2018 amounts to $440 billion. This is around 12% of our original $100 revenue. It means means there is around a $12 deficit, so we've spent the grand total of $112. The question we must now ask ourselves is, will the US get out of debt, or will the debt keep growing? Well, like many other countries, the US can just print its own money, so when in debt, just keep printing, right? Some people think this is not a good idea, as it could lead to a financial crisis, and of course, it might upset the people whose taxes are going towards paying off the debt. A simple solution to the debt would seem to be to cut government spending or raise taxes, but the risk is that this might hamper economic growth. Another solution is to boost economic growth so it grows faster than the debt. In terms of the $100, how can the US use it in areas where it will see higher returns? For example, some analysts believe the US should spend less on defense and more on public infrastructure. Where do you think the US should be allocating its money for the best of the American people? What would you do with the budget? Let us know in the comments. Be sure to check.
So think about how you would create a budget. And I think we've done something similar to this in the past, but I want you to really think in the role of the president. So for step 3, imagine you were president and you had to make a budget request that would be approved or denied by Congress. The only caveat is that Congress will not approve your request unless your request cuts discretionary spending from 1.3 trillion to 1 trillion. So I want you to create an itemized budget using the following categories that adds up to $1 trillion. So you're going to use all of these categories and think about what might be cut, right? So you're not going to have 1.3 trillion like the fiscal year 2020. You're going to only have 1 trillion. So you want to think about what programs you might cut in your budget proposal to Congress. In step 4, you're thinking about the consequences of the programs that you chose to restrict funding from. You're going to answer these questions. What categories of the budget did you cut? Why did you choose those? Research the programs that you cut. What specific types of programs within the categories might suffer cuts? What consequences come from these program cuts? Think of jobs, resources in your response. Do you think your budget cuts will be politically popular? In other words, will Congress and the public like your budget cuts and want to approve it? And then what you're ultimately submitting is your responses for 2 through 4 to this assignment. Have a great day.